Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. Today's guest is an accomplished mezzo-soprano. A member of an El Salvadorian family, she draws upon the varied and rich influences of her upbringing within her artistry. Inspired by all the arts, she seeks to bring thoughtful and dedicated vision to any of her various creative endeavors. I'm so looking forward to chatting with her today, so please join me in welcoming Amber Fasquelle to The Conscious Artist. Amber, I'm thrilled you're here with us today.
I'm so happy to be with you. It's really exciting for me.
Thank you. It is my pleasure. Today's topic, we have a lot of things to cover, and concepts like power imbalances, gender discrimination, feminism, the patriarchy, these are all very controversial topics. And ironically, they tend to be the most controversial for the very people that perpetuate the problems. But the real truth is that power dynamics and power imbalances exist in every field, in every country, all around the world, as does gender discrimination. And what so many people don't realize is that while the patriarchy has affected women the most and for the longest, men have also been suffering because of backwards thinking and societal oppression. So today, as Amber and I speak, I would like to remind myself and all of my wonderful listeners to have compassion and empathy and an open mind, and remember that we are all first and foremost human beings. Thank you so much, Amber, for being willing and open to have these conversations with me on these topics, because I know some of them hit really deep. So for anything and everything that you feel comfortable sharing, the floor is yours. Would you mind sharing, to start us off, sort of your first experiences with power imbalances, or dare I say, even abuse of power?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to laugh for a second because I feel like this conversation continuously finds me, whether I want it to find me or not. It's beautiful and it's wonderful and it should be talked about. And so thank you for inviting me into this delicate and important conversation. So where to begin? I feel like being born into the world, one has to contend with these dynamics, but particular being a classical musician and an opera singer on top of that, I don't think that there's an institution that I've been part of where I haven't had to be submitted in some capacity, greater or lesser, to this dynamic of power and power through the sexes. So I guess to speak broadly about it, being indoctrinated at a young age, educated through classical music, this element of power conflict is there from the beginning. It's funny, I'm thinking right now about Mozart in the Jungle. Can't remember the writer's name, but she speaks so eloquently about this kind of indoctrination that we're exposed to in our early years of being educated. And it can be more subtle at that point. It can be sort of just an introduction into this sort of mythology of gender roles and that obviously comes along with the Western historical canon and the material, the repertoire that we're working with in classical music. But I think that whatever way in which we're exposed through our education is intensified in the actual working world. So, yeah, I would say that my first experiences, I'd say my first more intense experiences were in conservatory. That's kind of the first entry into the institution at large. And, the first thing I want to say is that the patriarchy takes many forms, and it's something that extends itself into anyone who is in a position of power. So that's not just a male-bodied individual. That can be a female. It can be anyone across the gender spectrum, across the identity spectrum. So I think what interests me is this relationship to power and how we as human beings mishandle power. Across the gamut, I think I've experienced this issue.
What do you think it is that makes people in power sort of change from being curious or having a desire to grow and to learn more of their skill and to have more, for example, maybe a wider reach with their art, to becoming people who can even abuse that power? Like I'm wondering if those that come to power, that abuse their position and the power that they have, if that's something that's inherently part of their character and their personality. Is that something that's taught? Is that something that's learned? I'm really curious what you think.
That's such a great question. I mean, my intuition is to say that unfortunately, in our world and society, I think we're not given many options in terms of the embodiment of power. So I think that that's like a collective issue that we have, that individuals who find themselves in positions of power, they're kind of given no toolkit in terms of how to enter into that position, how to uphold themselves with respect and dignity and responsibility. And I
Right.
think that it's a societal issue at large. We can say it stems from the patriarchy, but a lot of the people that I've met who have found themselves in powerful positions, some who became friends or mentors, some whom, I needed to distance myself from, or some of those relationships ended entirely. I imagine that probably a lot of those individuals stepped into their power, perhaps not being conditioned around it, and over time, what I imagine is that it's an insidious process. So you probably enter into the position very excited about, the prospects of your success or future and whatnot. And I think it takes a very rare individual to be placed in that position and maintain a sort of groundedness and level-headedness and humility about their leadership position. I think
Right.
what's particularly interesting about classical music as a historical art form is that there is within it a sort of embodiment of almost like monarchical structures. So, you have this approach to the power figure where everyone else is sort of obligingly approaching this individual on their knees, so to speak, metaphorically. So, we want this person to be this God figure. We want them to be this great kind of hero figure. And so rather than kill our gods, we would rather put ourselves in a position where we accept their abuse and the sort of disintegration of their morals in order to uphold the image we have of them. So,
Mm.
whether that be director, conductor, teacher, coach, or even a colleague, whatever that position is, we sort of embody, I find, in the culture, an allowance for bad behavior
Mm.
because of, well, they're a genius. Well, of course, they're just an artist. They're such a great artist and we must allow them their temper tantrums. I think it's a collective issue. It's like, letting somebody get away. And over time, the more they get away with this bad behavior, the more that they embody it freely.
This is very interesting, actually, because a few episodes ago, I spoke with one of my colleagues who's a violinist, Lily Francis, and we spoke about the evolution and psychology of teaching. And we were specifically speaking about how when we were growing up, our teachers, they were, often the generation of not only our parents, but even our grandparents. And there was a lot of tolerance for what we would now today call absolutely unacceptable behavior because they were great masters, because they were these incredible artists and maestros, and you revered them, you respected them to the point of almost fearing them.
Mm.
And we were comparing sort of teaching today, the psychology of teaching today, with the psychology of parenting today.
Mm.
And I think it's really interesting that you've brought this up in this way because, like you were saying, it takes a rare individual to sort of be able to hold on to their groundedness as they ascend to power, shall we say. And I wonder if does that come from a lack of, you know what, sorry, that's a judgmental way to say it. I was going to say a lack of certain values, but that's my own personal
I don't
judgment.
think that's judgmental at all. I think that, yeah, I would say probably that's a core ingredient in somebody falling into a loss of their responsibility. They like the classic saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And I
Sure.
think that one of the deteriorating factors of that is losing a sense of your value system. When
Mm,
you start to become hazy, when you start to replace other values, it requires one to be deeply reflective.
right. But then we have the question of like, is it nature versus nurture,
Mm,
right? Do people change the way we're talking about in a negative sense, right?
mm,
Do people change because of the environment that they're put in, because of the people that they are surrounded with, because of the energy and most likely the toxicity that surrounds their workplace, whether it's orchestra or opera or finance banks?
mm.
I mean, we know investment banks are crazy about their kind of work life. So I'm just curious, also having dealt with this in my own personal life, with people that I have seen in my life changing over time and others who really remain true to their core.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a beautiful contemplation. I think we're sponges. I mean, I know I am. And depending on the environment I'm in, I see specific aspects of my personality come out or not. Perhaps it's a bit of both. It's this interesting chemistry of character and environment that take place. And I think what's tricky is that when somebody comes into power, you don't really know what aspects of them are going to sort of be maintained throughout that ascent, right?
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's very, very easy to become corrupt. I mean, I think this is like,
Well, we see it with politicians every day.
right. And it's also like history/philosophy 101. I mean, the Stoic philosophers were constantly meditating on politicians, politics, and the times and
Right.
human nature. And I think what's unpopular to say, it's not that I don't see the magic and the beauty of human beings and what we're capable of. But I think in a very unpopular way, in the times we're living in, we don't take sort of a critical enough relation to ourselves in
Mm,
terms of our fallibility. Because in the past, I'm not a religious person, but religion was more of a staple in terms of informing culture in history. And that kept people's behavior in check. Having
right.
this authority figure looming over you, judging your behavior. And so when that dissipates from culture, which it has, not that it's not there, but how do we uphold the standard of our person and of our character?
Right. Well, and this is where therapy comes in. This is where psychology comes in. This is where having someone who is learned and educated in the study of the mind and how our minds work, how we work as human beings, to help us hold ourselves accountable, or rather to give us the tools. And I feel like this is part of the issue, that for a long time, a lot of society didn't have the tools
Mm,
to manage changes that occur in our lives. And so it's very easy then to get swayed, to get influenced, to get pressure, to get corrupted. And it takes a lot of courage, I think, to hold oneself accountable
mm,
and be able to look in the mirror and say, hey, you know what? That wasn't right.
mm,
I'd like to amend that.
mm.
Because around that comes a lot of shame and
Yeah.
guilt. And that's a big thing that we're usually not taught how to deal with. And I know from just own personal experience, I had a really hard time apologizing when I was younger, particularly to my parents, because I just wanted their approval. But I felt so ashamed and so embarrassed
Mm,
that I messed up, that I had to go and apologize to them, that I wasn't perfect for them. I wasn't their perfect
mm,
daughter. And through a lot of therapy, and of course, also through aging and experience and life events and things, I've also come to the place where, I mean, I don't know, I don't think we can ever say it's 100%, but I'm certainly at a very high percentage of recognizing that taking accountability for something that I've done wrong, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, does not make me
mm,
smaller. In fact, it makes my heart grow more because it gives me the chance to have compassion for myself and to recognize that it's okay not to be perfect, because there's no such thing,
mm.
and to have compassion for others.
That is so beautiful. That is so, so beautiful. Wow. I mean, yes, like, yes, 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 and yes. I think, this actually beautifully ties into this question of patriarchy and this topic, because I think that we've distanced ourselves from being able to forgive and talk about forgiveness. I think, of course, like one has to be able to come to accountability, ask for forgiveness, apologize. And I think shame and embarrassment and all of these uncomfortable emotions are part of that process. Not that one should stay in shame. I'm thinking about Brene Brown and all of her work. But
Right.
I think that it's a critical moment of self-reflection to go, oh, I messed up. That's been part of my maturation process, making a lot of mistakes and realizing I need to be asking this person for, well, not even asking them for forgiveness, but just apologizing. I'm so
Right.
sorry for having wronged you in any way. So it's not something that we're in contact with enough. But also, the other side of that is that we're also not, at this moment in time, there isn't a dialogue about apology and then the other side of that apology. And how do we create dynamics with one another where we can accept an apology and move forward? And sometimes moving forward, it looks like many things. Maybe it means a reparation of the relationship, but maybe it doesn't.
And both of those are
And
okay.
both of those are okay. Humanity is complex. It's like somebody who is a dark figure and makes mistakes. They might have some nice qualities. It's
Yeah. Well, I mean, because we're not split into good and bad people. All of us have light and dark inside of us. All of us have the capability of being the best person in the world and being the worst person in the world, right?
Mhm.
And that's why it goes back to the question of, is it nature versus nurture?
Yeah.
Because, you and I, God forbid, are both capable of committing a heinous crime, but I don't think we
Yeah,
would
right.
ever. Do you know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
But we have that capability within us. And perhaps if we had been raised in different environments with different parents, with hardships that are, beyond our comprehension, we would have different values. And then we would have a different outlook on life. And then we would have a different way of relating with people and with ourselves and with the world. And we wouldn't have these tools that we have through therapy to be able to have a conversation like this. And maybe we would be going down a path that for us today is unfathomable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so complex. There, you're talking about the constellation of what creates an individual, and there are so many aspects and components that go into that. But I think, in terms of apology and forgiveness, I think it's an unpopular thing to do. Somehow both are
Yeah.
unpopular, to apologize and then, to forgive. But I think in saying that, what's coming up for me is that I want to emphasize that you can have empathy and compassion for somebody and also not accept or condone their bad behavior.
1,000%,
So
yes.
that's where, for me, things become very clear. And that's thankfully a boundary, is that, okay, yes, this industry is full of egomaniacs and narcissists and abusers. And I can have empathy and compassion with their life journey being difficult, etc. But my hard line is bad behavior is bad behavior, and you've got to be accountable for that.
Yeah.
And I think what's hard is that when you have individuals who are so sensitive to that, and how can we be artists and open and cultivating and living into our sensitivity if we're in this predicament in our working environments where that's at stake? Because in any moment, you can be treated poorly. And so
Yeah.
I know, speaking for myself, in so many environments I've worked in, I've had to navigate somewhat guarded. So the only place and time that I feel I can really open myself is when it's the performance, because in that moment I'm safe.
Right.
But the fault is the system, because I know individuals who are working in this industry who speak out or want to speak out and are saddened and burdened by the weight of attempting that change falling on their own shoulders, because the system hasn't built a robust way of confronting this issue. So I think things are much further along in the States at this point, but in Europe, it's a little further behind.
Right.
So we need people to be in administrative positions that are deeply concerned with the ethics of the way the thing functions. I think what will happen from that standpoint and that approach is that actually more creativity and more beauty will be generated in music and on stages. And I think that's the unrecognized unknown, unfortunately, that administrators have not yet understood, that actually you're going to get better synergy and better product from people working together in this way, rather than having this authority figure who dictates everything.
I think that's a very poignant point. And going back to what you said about being accountable, essentially being accountable for our actions, I have to point out the fact that I think it's the sad but real truth that women tend to be more willing to be accountable. And I feel that men have a much harder time. It stems from ego, from a desire of power, the ego coming in the way. And this takes us back to the patriarchy that not only affects women, but also men, right? And there's one actor that I absolutely love. His name is Justin Baldoni, and he has a podcast called Man Enough. It started out as a YouTube series. He's also done a TED Talk. He also has a book called Man Enough, and he is absolutely entrenched in making a positive change in the world regarding toxic masculinity and how we can redefine what it means to be masculine. And it is men like him who are paving the way. Justin and his colleagues on his Man Enough podcast, his colleagues in the actor world that are also trying to contribute to a healthier view of masculinity, redefining what it means to be masculine, to be vulnerable, to allow yourself to feel, to allow yourself to cry. There's also a beautiful quote from Emma Watson, as we know, big feminist. She says, both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. And this is an age-old issue that we've had, telling men, don't cry, be a man, be tough, be strong, don't show your feelings, don't show your emotions, don't show your weaknesses. And how heavy must that be for them to also suppress essentially what it means to be human?
I mean, you're nailing it. Yeah. It's making me think of The Will to Power by Bell Hooks. And it's, for me, that piece has been one of the most important works of feminist literature that I've read, because she so bravely takes a humanitarian and truly, in my opinion, feminist stance in creating a lens and an analysis of patriarchy that understands the effect it has on men, because they're suffering too. I mean, it's like, poor men, like, oh, they have it so hard. Of course, like, yeah, they've definitely got an advantage in society, but at the same time, they don't. Because they don't even realize the ways in which they're bound and enslaved by the system to be authoritative, to be perhaps disconnected to, speaking of sexuality, to be vulnerable, to be soft, to be tender, to be open, to be emotional.
And then this is where the Me Too movements come into play, right? Because that lack of comprehension and understanding and connection with oneself can very often lead to behaviors that are absolutely unacceptable.
Well, because their collective psyche is damaged. And, in my view of somebody who would be assaulting women, this is obviously an ill individual, but who has unfortunately been so affected by patriarchal norms that they will do anything to maintain the sense of their ego being in power. And that comes at the cost of the safety of women. And it's quite dark and quite ugly. But I think that what's so important about, kind of analyzing, and I'm not a professional psychologist or by any means, but just in living and working in environments where I've seen this sort of thing break down time and time again. If I'm to take any kind of compassionate stance towards a person causing harm in this way, it would be that their psyche is so damaged, they're so desperate to prove themselves about their inherent manliness or whatever, that they're willing to delude themselves to harm other women, at the cost of women and their safety for the enrichment of their ego or something. I mean, it's problematic, but what's also problematic is that, again, I come back to this point, the culture encourages it. So, if you're like in opera, if you're working within the stories of Don Giovanni and, whatever, take any Puccini opera. it's so thick, this like romanticizing of the male macho figure. And I feel like that seeps into the psyche of the people who work with this material. And then they go about their lives kind of trying to embody this figure of seduction and male bravado without understanding the aspects of it that are toxic or aggressive.
I'm so glad you brought this up. I was literally thinking the same thing, that especially with opera, right? Especially with opera, a lot of some of the greatest operas that we all know and love are actually really terrible
Definitely
storylines.
terrible.
And the lyrics and the words, if you translate
Right.
them, like for those of us that don't speak Italian fluently or German fluently or whatever, I mean, we would never accept that today. And this is
Mm,
by no means to say that like these operas should be banned. That's not the
mm,
point, right? Because that was also acceptable in a way at that time
right.
period. I do think you make a very important point, which is that because, especially with opera, it's like acting, right? You need to embody that character. You need to become that character. You need to live in that character.
Mm.
And perhaps there's maybe a little bit too much of like method acting that comes into play there.
Yeah, and I think, the other element of opera that's distinct from like theater is that, I mean, of course, in theater you have types as well, but in opera, because of your voice and the limitation of the repertoire you can sing, it becomes even more narrow. So, the soprano being the fainting, sick woman, or princess, whatever, and the baritone being the evil, debonair seductor, it's like when you play that over and over and over again, and you're not given context to analyze it, unless you're working with a fantastic director by chance and luck, you just keep perpetuating this kind of role over and over and over again. And, we are sponges, like we're ingesting everything in life. And whether you're conscious of it or not, I think that it leaves an imprint on the person you become. Not to say that like every baritone that sung Don Giovanni became Don Giovanni, but
No,
there
but
is something to talk about there. There's also this delusion in classical music that like, to be the genius and to be great, you have to embody this kind of chaotic lifestyle and I don't know, adopt a lifestyle that's probably harmful to yourself and others. Yeah, it's interesting how these things have developed over time and have been normalized. But I think that it's like very, very clear to me, especially because my work has gone in different directions beyond opera. And I've, worked with performance artists and in theater. And I've seen that it's very distinct within opera. It's very distinct within classical music because the material is infiltrating our minds all the time. So it does kind of shape us in a way that we're not perhaps fully conscious of.
this is such an interesting point that you make. You're right. Like there is a lot more sort of typecasting,
Mm.
right? In opera, like in classical music, yes, maybe these composers, some of them were not the best role models as human beings. But, if I'm playing, I don't know, some solo piano sonata by someone and the music is just this incredibly divine work of art, what I'm relating to is not to the composer themselves, but to the music and how this art form is connecting with me,
Mm.
right? So, like, there's a kind of detachment in a way from the
Mm.
creator, and it's more about how does it come towards me? How do I relate to this piece of music? Whereas I feel like what you're saying with opera, when you have limited roles that you can play just simply based on a vocal range, even,
Exactly. Exactly.
then you have a lot more restriction in detaching because you have to embody it in order to play that well in a way, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like at the end of the day, people who are in positions of power that abuse that power are simply just big bullies.
Mhm,
Do you know what I mean?
mhm.
Like bullies, what we grew up in school knowing as bullies were people that would make fun of us, people that would torment us, people that would, essentially assert their age or
Mhm,
their size
mhm,
over
mhm,
us. And it was like maybe in third grade to fourth grade, right?
mhm,
Like it was somebody from fourth grade who's like, well, I'm older and I'm bigger. right? I mean, something as seems as innocuous as that. But then fast forward 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, and it feels like the behavior is the
It's
same,
absolutely
just
the
on a
same.
like on a magnified level.
Yes, like yes, yes, and yes. It's so interesting because I actually have done a bit of reading and listening about exactly this topic, which is like the adult bully. And what I find so fascinating from my personal research is that the bully deep down actually wants you to put them in their place, which was
Hmm.
interesting. Like, it further explains that point that I was referencing from the Bell Hooks book, which is that they're suffering too. Those in the patriarchy having to abide by that role. Like, if you want to be held accountable, it's because you're not really truly happy.
I'm gonna challenge that and say that I feel like it might be even more than just being held accountable. I think bullies probably are the people that most want to be heard and seen,
Mm, yeah.
right? I mean, again, this is really, it takes a lot of detachment to be able to have empathy and compassion towards people that have hurt us to our core,
Hmm.
towards
Hmm.
narcissists, towards abusers, towards people that have gaslit us or manipulated us or betrayed us, right? Like it takes a lot of inner strength and detachment to be able to like step back and look at this person as a human being rather than taking their actions and behaviors personally.
Right. Yeah, it does. And sometimes
And it's not
yeah,
easy.
and I was going to say sometimes it's impossible because especially in the case
Yeah.
of, and I have been bullied in the industry, and the nature of bullying is that it's repetitive, and it's happening constantly, and it's exhausting and you get to a point where you just can't anymore. So, even having said that, like, what the bully wants is to be called out, essentially, it's also so complex because it's not fair that essentially changing the dynamic falls on the victim all the time.
Well, and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, sometimes it's not our journey. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like we can stand up for ourselves and stand in our truth and fight for justice and fight for fairness for us, but we can't do it with the expectation that the other will change. Of course, that is what we're aiming for. Of course, that's what we're aiming to change. We're aiming to change a societal systemic
Mm.
injustice that happens, right? But if we also fight with the expectation that we will only be okay once we get that
Mm.
validation or once we find that justice for whatever trauma we had to experience, then essentially we're holding ourselves in that
Mm.
place, right? Like we are dependent on the
Mm.
bully
Mm.
or the
For
abuser.
their behavior to stop, which may not. Yeah.
I don't know. It's very
It is,
complex.
but I think, and I would say this to anybody that is suffering from abuse in any shape or form, whether it be bullying or assault or whether they have a Me Too story, whatever it is, I would say that don't stay quiet.
Right,
Because
right. No, no, no.
the
Exactly.
only thing, you can't trust that the bully or the abuser is going to change, but what you can usually trust are people who see what's going on and speaking to them and speaking as soon as possible, because that's, the mistake that I've made in my lifetime and time again is enduring the abuse, normalizing the abuse to the point where I break. And then I come to find out once I break that there were people along who saw what was happening and who would have supported me. And, that's such a life-changing thing to realize, like, okay, you don't have to suffer in silence, and
You're not alone.
you're not alone. And that's actually what changes the system, I feel, is people coming together.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and it's okay to ring the alarm bell and say, help, I'm uncomfortable, help, I'm not being treated well. So this is part of what dismantles this kind of culture of bowing down to the authority figure and the great master. It's like, actually, you can be, the most amazingly talented whatever, but it doesn't matter at all if you don't have respect for me. But we are the ones that have to change that dynamic. I think part of it, this is adding another level to the conversation, but I think part of it is economy. When you have musicians and artists that are desperate to work, they'll put up with anything. And I think you and I are in a privileged position to be holding American passports and coming from a
Yeah.
culture that is
Yeah.
outspoken, where we have enough means to speak, because we're not going to be destitute if we live by our values. But there are people who come from different countries who have fought so hard to get far in their career. And to speak out would be to jeopardize everything they've built.
Yeah.
And so they endure and endure and endure bad behavior and perhaps normalize it to an extent that they reframe it and call it something else. So that's also been something that I've had to soften around, because when I first started working in the industry, I was deeply frustrated by colleagues and women in particular who accepted certain kinds of behavior and treatment. And at this point, I have a bit more understanding of where that comes from and why. And actually, I don't judge it anymore. I did in the beginning, but now I just think, okay, the place that this person is coming from is so complex that, I just have to respect it. Maybe it's not their lot in life to sort of fight the system in the way that you and I could by speaking, because we can speak, because we have the means to speak.
This is such an important point you've made. And yes, I want to backtrack and make it very, very clear that what I was saying before about not being dependent on your abuser or your bully to feel justice or find justice, what I meant by that is that this is where we can take our power back. Literally, like this is where we take control of the narrative. And if something is unacceptable for us, we don't tolerate it anymore. My therapist always says the toxic game stops when you stop catching the ball.
Yeah.
And so if a behavior is unacceptable for us, we have to stop accepting that behavior. Then, as you say, depending on how privileged we are, where we come from, do we have a voice? Are we even allowed a voice? Right? How many women in the world do we know are not even allowed a voice? So all of those layers also add to the next steps of, can I speak out about this? Will I be heard about this? Will I be supported with this? Will other people come forward and share their stories so that we can have a collective movement and a collective change? And that's where, for example, like the Me Too movement has been so powerful, because you can literally ask any woman on the street if they've had some sort of altercation that made them uncomfortable, physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and they will say yes. And that's just not okay.
Right.
And that's not to say that women aren't abusers as well. I mean, I think
Exactly.
we both have seen the movie Tar.
Yeah.
And while I think a lot of probably women felt a little bit frustrated that the first big movie in Hollywood that was finally talking about classical music and finally highlighting classical music was also highlighting a female abuser, where that is like such a small percentage, but it's actually true as well. And it's essentially just this power game, right?
Right. And, I've had this conversation about Tar with many people, and I really actually think that it was a very wise choice that they made to cast that role as a woman, because I think if it had been a male, it would have been written off as a very stereotypical issue and a bit boring. But the reality is that this is a human issue, and it drives the point home that the patriarchy is something that we're all part of and all embodying to greater or lesser degrees, or supporting. So I think it also created a dynamic where you had more empathy potentially for the character because she was a woman. And that's interesting, because we all sort of fell for her more and then were let down. And I think that there would have been more resistance to the character, the human aspects of the character, had it been a man. But I think it's an excellent choice they made, because it brings the topic of the patriarchy to all of us. And I have definitely worked with women who were in power positions and mishandled their power. So for me, it really is a systemic issue that affects all of us, regardless of your gender or sexual preferences, or even a marginalized person in society can be put in a position of power and misuse that power. It's making me think of Freire, this Brazilian essayist who wrote about this very issue, that how do we educate so that when people who have been abused ascend to power, they do not repeat the cycle of trauma.
Right, exactly.
So Tar is complicated as a film, but it generated, I think, a lot of important points.
I agree with you. I thought it was spectacularly done. And I think I really thank you for your thoughts on it and your perspective on it. I mean, this is ultimately like a human issue that we have, right? Like we're all suffering from systemic problems and systemic injustice. And when people like you and I, women, are having this type of conversation, it's because we want to find a healthy change for all human beings, right? Like not just us, but like how we as women, we're looking for ways to help men hear us and understand us. We need men to hear us and understand us and realize that they're also affected by the patriarchy. And without their conscious efforts to make long-term sustainable changes in the concept of masculinity and power imbalance, right? Changes in redefining masculinity, power, both men, but especially women, suffer. And this is not even to mention the detrimental effects on trans and non-binary people and basically all human beings. Right.
Exactly.
And so like, I feel so strongly, and maybe just because my heart is too soft, but I really feel that compassion and empathy can truly change the world. Like this is what the world is missing. This is why we have so many wars, because there's so much lack of tolerance and acceptance, and tolerance and acceptance come from compassion and empathy to others that are different from you. Sorry, I get very emotional about it.
No, that is so passionately put and beautifully said. And yes, I think what's tricky is that, I mean, I as a woman have found myself in many moments where I had too much compassion for an abuser. And so this is where, I come back to what I said before about having empathy, but having hard lines about what is bad behavior.
100%. I totally agree with you. I was like a people pleaser, roll over, accept everything. And now I feel like I can talk about compassion and empathy because I have hard boundaries.
Yeah. And thank God for that. I mean, I also, being deeply soft-hearted, took me a long time to earn my hard boundaries.
Right. And a lot of hard experiences.
Especially that. So it's a gift. I mean, that's the way that we can keep informing the conversation and moving it forward and challenging and changing. But the thing that I really want to say is that this is going to take a really long, long time, and not to be disheartened, because in my own experiences, you want to see the world transform itself now. And it's one drop in the ocean at a time. And it's going to take years. It's going to take decades. It's going to take centuries. But we're so far along. And I think we have to remind ourselves of the ways in which we're far along. The fact that we can have this conversation in different countries about the same topics, and that anybody can listen to this, that in and of itself is a gift. So I just feel like whatever the way is that you can contribute, figuring out what that means, and also self-care, that I've had moments in my life where I really went to the front lines and fought. And then I had to step back and I had to go, okay, now I'm tired. I don't have to be the sacrificial lamb in every moment. I can take care of myself. I can accept the effort that I made and ask myself what kind of effort I can make now that might not be as involved in sort of a loud kind of way, but how can I keep being part of this conversation? How can I keep changing my behavior in my life? And how can I keep inviting people into this view of things where we're just human beings, we're being kind to each other? And that's what I would say to anyone, is being part of this is complex, but be part of it in the way that you can be, even if that's just talking about it to somebody you trust.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I could not agree more. This is so beautifully put. Thank you, Amber. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having this conversation with me. I could talk to you for hours about this. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface.
We will. We'll keep talking about this for hours.
For sure. But I really am so grateful for your presence and your courage and your willingness to be here and have this conversation.
Well, I have equal gratitude to you for having the willingness to bring this to the forefront and the strength to hold space for such a complex and uncomfortable and painful topic. So gratitude to you.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page @ConsciousArtistPodcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength to tackle this week, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of The Conscious Artist.